Hello everyone, happy Friday. Welcome back to another episode of the Matt Levine My Generation podcast. Of course, we have co-host Noah Levy in his comfy once again. And we have author Jen Lambert, author of Voter Z, which is coming out in April 2021. Jen Lambert, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing pretty well. I'm totally excited for the weekend because
Yes.
this past week of school has just been nuts. But you've been on break, so you go to Villanova, right?
Yes, I do go to Villanova.
Cool. And so you're also an SPF alum. We were talking about this a little bit before. You're an SPF alum of 2018. And it's kind of crazy that next year when Noah and we graduate high school, you're gonna be off into the workforce.
I know, it makes me feel a little bit old, I gotta say.
Noah, how are you doing?
I'm good. You ready for the weekend to write this paper?
Oh yeah, so we actually have after this podcast, we have to get ready for a 20-page Deca paper that we have to write.
Oh
Yeah,
my
so
gosh.
Noah wrote me in on that 20-page paper this past week, and we have about 5 days to write it.
You can do it. You know, if I can write a whole book, I'm sure you guys can handle a 20-page paper.
Yeah, and so my first question for you is, what was it like to write a book during the pandemic? I'm sure you had a ton of time on your hands since everything was shut down, but to write a book during the pandemic, stressful.
Mm-hmm. So it was about a year ago this week, actually, that I decided for sure that I was going to write this book. And obviously, like everyone else, I had no clue what was about to happen in my life and in everybody's lives, really. And kind of started writing and researching toward the end of March when I was home from college because of the pandemic, obviously. But it, in a way, it was a very weird blessing in disguise because, like you said, I never would have had all this time on my hands to get this book done if this pandemic didn't happen. So I think it's definitely been my one silver lining with all this going on.
And you mentioned that it's nearly been a year ago since you decided you wrote this book. Why'd you decide then that you decided to embark on this opportunity?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I felt like it was the right time. I had been approached about writing the book actually the previous fall, and I decided, it wasn't really the right time for me then. And I thought, maybe sometime in the future it'll work out. And I kind of had something happen to me at the beginning of January where I was like, I just feel like right now is the right time to write this. And obviously I knew it was an election year, so I would have the time to write it beforehand, taking a look at, the kind of cycle, the electoral cycle, and getting to go through the primaries and through the general writing this book, and then have a little bit of time after the election to kind of look back and reflect on the things that happened in 2020. Obviously, I didn't know how crazy the year was going to be, but it did happen at the right time, I think. So.
And I'm sure it did. How crazy this year was, like we were talking about before, it's definitely silver lining because you definitely had a lot more content to write about too.
Yeah, I never thought, it wasn't in the original plan to be writing about what it means to be a generation growing up in the middle of a pandemic, but that is an element that got added to this book, and obviously everything that's been going on politically too has been something I've been able to fold into the book in a way.
Yeah, and you mentioned before that you were approached writing this book. Kind of describe to us, was writing a book something that you've always been interested in? And then I guess why it's interesting, people approaching college students about writing books. Like, you don't really see many college students writing books, so I think that's pretty cool.
Yeah, so I've always wanted to write a book. It's always been on my bucket list. I never thought it happened to me when I was 20 years old, but here I am about to be a published author. So it is pretty cool to get that, checked off so early in my life. And I'd like to write another one at some point too, because I really love the process. But yeah, I've been writing for some time. I write for the Odyssey, which is a national content platform for college students, and I got involved with the Currently vertical there, which is politics and activism focused. And I started posting about it on LinkedIn and kind of advertising myself as a writer. And a professor at Georgetown, Professor Eric Kester, he runs the Creator Institute there, which he started a class kind of along the lines of entrepreneurship of, okay, you're going to take a semester and you're going to write the manuscript to a book. And he took that course, and he kind of, expanded it out, and he wanted to bring other college students into it. So he started to kind of offer that to different college students. And the way that he would do that was by finding writers who were in college through LinkedIn. So I kind of got lucky that he came upon my work and approached me about it.
That's incredible. And for, I'm sure our listeners like kind of didn't know that there are those types of opportunities out there. Like
Mm-hmm.
I read for the Fan but I couldn't imagine like being approached just because I wrote for like a school newspaper or at a national
Mm-hmm.
platform like the Odyssey, and then being approached like the next day, hey, you're pretty good. Do you want to write a book? Like that's crazy to me. So that's a
Mm-hmm.
really awesome opportunity. And so when you were developing your ideas for the book, was it always around? Did you always have this idea of wanting to write about Generation Z? Like, what was the driving force behind, um, like pretty much Voter Z?
Mm-hmm. So I am a political science student. That's my major, and I have minors in communication and public service. So my education has kind of always been geared, obviously, towards the intersection of media and politics. And I am a young person, so I'm sure, like, you guys understand, you have conversation with your peers about this stuff, and it kind of made me look at it through the lens of a researcher. And I kind of thought, I'm already studying my peers. Why don't I take a look at it, and maybe I can tell this cohesive narrative about my generation and what I'm seeing around me. So that was kind of my original idea. And when I was approached by the professor in fall, we had an initial brainstorming call, and he did bring that up about, youth-led movements. Obviously the Parkland students, I tell them that story as kind of an inspiration story for me getting into politics. And I think that's something that's definitely piqued the national interest, as far as who are these young people at the forefront of some of these social and political movements. And it definitely was a topic that was relevant and timely, and the professor agreed with me. So I kind of thought I would start developing my idea from there. And yeah, that's how Voter Z was born.
Yeah, and my friend and a great colleague at the Fan Scotian, she wrote a great story about you, Emily
Mm-hmm.
Wyra. She opened with that moment during the March for Our Lives
Mm-hmm.
uh, walkout. And so, what was that? What was that like, sitting in Mr. Cagle's math class, and kind of everyone getting up all at once and being a part of this enormous movement?
Mm-hmm. I gotta admit, like, I was a little scared. Like, I'm like in my AP calculus class. It's a very serious class, and I'm just a student. And it's like, are other people gonna get up? Like, I don't know if I'm gonna be able to walk out if I'm the only one who's gonna be doing this. And then my friend stood up right at the time. I forget the time. I don't know if it was 10
Mhm.
o'clock or 10:30, but something along those lines. And she stood up, and then everyone started standing up, and I stood up, and I was like, okay, I'm doing this. And I walked out, and we all walked out up to like by where the track is and stuff. And there was some student speakers and stuff there. And it was a really empowering moment. And I remember, seeing footage from all across the country of it happening at high schools, not just in America, across the world,
Yeah.
really. And it was awesome to be just a little bit of a part of that. And it showed me that, I do have a voice, and my peers have voices too, and they matter, and people will listen if we're loud enough. So that was really an important moment for me.
And I'll never forget that Noah, we were in eighth grade at Tarot at that point, and I remember that people were very upset about what was happening,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm pretty sure 5 or 6 students did go to the main office, and they announced this beforehand. Anyone who would leave the school building, like, they would get in massive trouble,
Mm-hmm.
and those 5 students, they did leave the building. They just walked through the double doors past the secretary's office, and I'm pretty sure they got in trouble,
Mm-hmm.
but they definitely did send an important message. And even though they technically weren't allowed to, I thought that was an important act of rebellion. I, at
Mm-hmm.
that point, though, was way too scared to get disciplined, and I'm still very scared about rebelling against the rule of law, especially when it comes to discipline.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a bit of a coward when it comes to that, right, Noah?
I mean, yeah, I think we could have done it looking back on it in eighth grade. I mean,
I think we could have too, but there were a small pool of students who were wanted to do something, and then the rest were indifferent. And hindsight, I was
Mm-hmm.
definitely a little bit more indifferent because of course, discipline. So who do you kind of credit as your inspirations behind this book? We talked about the Georgetown professor and also a couple of your professors at Villanova, but is there anyone specific that you recognize as a like a driving force behind supporting you and stuff?
Behind supporting me, I would say obviously my family has been a huge source of support for me throughout this. My dad is a writer and a journalist, so he's always been a source of inspiration for me in these kind of endeavors. And I've had a few professors, like you mentioned at Villanova, who've been supportive of me, um, who have encouraged me to continue to write and to pursue some kind of career in writing. So I'm definitely thankful to them. And I'm thankful also to the youth activists who helped to inspire some of the stories in this book, and specifically the students at Parkland who organized the March for Our Lives. That was a huge awakening for me.
And you got in touch with some incredible people.
Mm-hmm.
And I know we're living in the age of social media and technology, but how did you go about kind of introducing yourself and getting those interviews?
Mm-hmm. So it is hard at first, right? You're thinking, okay, I want to tell these stories. Where am I going to find them? Um, I can't just, I have a few friends who are involved in this kind of stuff, and it'd be nice to interview them, but I don't want it just to be my circle, my little like echo chamber. I don't want, that's not what the book is about. So I kind of, when I reach out to some of my friends, I said, hey, do you know people who I could talk to? And they'd say, yeah, here's two people who I think, might be a good idea for you to talk to them. And I have one friend actually who graduated with me at Scotch Plains Fanwood, Alex, and he kind of has a big presence on what's kind of known as election Twitter, where people go and kind of engage in discourse about elections and national politics and stuff.
And Twitter is just such a funny platform to like
Mhm.
see everybody's opinions. It's hysterical. Anyway, I'm sorry about that.
Yeah, so there's kind of this online community there, and I knew he had a big presence, so I was like, hey, do you know people? Could you reach out to people for me on there? And he's like, you know what, I'm just gonna tweet about this project, and I'll just say, hey, my friend Jen is doing this. If you want to get involved, just message her. And I kid you not, that day I got like 40 DMs from people, and I was like, whoa. I was like,
You
what
have
is
to close
going
your
on?
DMs now.
Yeah, I was like, what is going on? I had to like tell some people like, sorry, I don't think I can like fit you into my schedule and stuff. And I wound up, creating this survey and collecting data from them. And it was really great for me. And then I got to kind of play this game of telephone in a way with my interviewees and be like, hey, give me two more people I could talk to. And then you find more and more people and you get this expanded network. So social media really helped me on this journey. I don't know what I would have done without it.
And that in a nutshell right there is like the power of social media. Like
Yeah.
it could just expand far and wide. Like technically our podcast has a presence in Japan,
Mm-hmm.
like international brand.
Yeah.
But all jokes aside, I guess what was it like to be able to talk to so many people from different backgrounds? Because the Northeast is much different from like the Deep South
Yeah.
or even the West Coast. So like, what were the differences and stories that you kind of received from all those different interviewees?
Hmm. Yeah, so I talk to people from coast to coast. Obviously, I'm a Jersey girl, so Northeast was kind of my starting point. People, Pennsylvania, but and in New Jersey too. I interviewed some people I know here, but then it kind of started to branch out, and I talked to someone in Florida. I just talked to someone from Texas this week. I talked to someone from Washington, Indiana, Iowa, Ohio. So it's kind of reached all different parts of this country, and that's what I wanted to touch on in this book, because again, I don't want it to just be my little safe bubble.
Mhm.
But yeah, I got to talk to people from all across the political spectrum. I got to talk to people who vote blue in red states or who vote red in blue states. So it's been interesting to kind of collect those stories, those narratives, and those experiences, and kind of reflect on them in a national context and say, what does this mean? What can we learn from this person in this state or this race that happened in this state? And what does that mean for our national politics as well? So I think it was hugely informative to be able to get so many different perspectives from across the country.
And was there a moment where like you were on the phone with one of your subjects and everything that they were saying you just fundamentally disagreed with, and like was there like some type of like debate going on?
I mean, it's very hard, and I say this, people talk about bias, we all have our own different perspectives, and that's obviously going to inform how we approach our subject matter. And I think especially in this time, it's a very heated time, so it can be difficult too. But yeah, I talk to socialists, I talk to a communist, I talk to libertarians. So obviously I'm on the phone with people who I disagree with, but you're just trying to collect their stories and their experiences, because their experiences are valid too. Um, but I think it helps, I tried to create this narrative that's cohesive throughout our generation.
Mhm.
And it helps that I have the insight and that I'm living and breathing these experiences that they're talking about as well. So while we may have differing perspectives, I think that we can be united just in our shared memory of these moments and being involved in the discourse around them. So while I may be fundamentally disagreeing with them, it is a valid perspective and it is a part of this broader narrative. So yeah, it's kind of hard to keep it to yourself at sometimes and not have that instinct to debate people. And sometimes, I do push people on their beliefs and their
Mhm.
opinions and stuff. But that's just to gain a deeper understanding of their opinions and why they think the way that they do. Because that's fundamentally what this book is about,
Yeah.
is why does this generation think the way that they do and why do they have the beliefs that they hold.
And there's definitely I still struggle with this too, like allowing like be able to agree to disagree and
Mhm.
allowing someone's experiences to be valid. Like I still struggle with that.
Mhm.
And I've spoken to a lot of my peers, and they also struggle with that. So like it's like
Mhm.
this ongoing learning curve to kind of
Mhm.
like accept other people's opinions. And so yeah, that's definitely
Mhm.
something that's like why people say like don't talk about politics with like your family, that type
Mhm.
of stuff. And it's frustrating too, because you should be able to talk about politics with your family and your friends and be able
Mhm.
to agree to disagree.
I think that does speak to a lot of the broader conversation happening in our country right now. But I think also, I was talking to an interviewee and she kept saying to me, people need to get comfortable with being uncomfortable.
Hmm.
And I think that that's so important because in order for us to have productive political debate in this country, we have to have open minds, and that is really hard. I'm not gonna overstate how or understate how
Yeah.
hard that is. It's really hard, but it's important because we have to have constructive conversations and we have to be willing to listen to each other. But that doesn't mean that we have to agree with what everyone is saying all the time.
Hmm. Was there a favorite you want to share, like a favorite anecdote or from one interviewee? Like you have a favorite
Yeah.
memory out of the whole book?
Favorite memory. That's hard. You know, I usually bring up this one story about Ethan Block. He was a program director for the March for Our Lives in Philadelphia. And I think that's a great story. But also, this week I got to talk to a young woman named Chrissy from Texas who is an organizer. And I think that her story is so important. She's the same age as me. She is an immigrant. She grew up in America, in Texas, her entire life. And she has worked on a presidential campaign, two Senate campaigns, a congressional campaign, a school board campaign.
And she's
And
20.
yes, she's the same age as me. And I was like, you are making me look like I do nothing. But I think it's so amazing that people are getting so involved at such an early age. And she kind of talked about how she would walk into these rooms. Actually, she walked into um, a fundraiser for Kamala Harris when she was doing her presidential campaign, and everyone in the room was like, "What are you doing here? Like, you're a kid. We never see kids at these things." Like, kind of like they were just like marveling at her, what are you doing here? So I think that's one of my favorite stories now, is because I just think that it's so amazing that young people are getting involved and that they are making a difference. Like, she just organized in the Georgia Senate race for John Ossoff, obviously, which decided control of the Senate. So I think young people's voices matter, their actions matter, their experiences matter. And I think that Chrissy's story is a part of that and a part of Generation Z gaining more political power in this country and fundamentally making a difference in not just local but national politics as well.
And I found a quote from you, and you said younger generations are a lot less polarized than other generations.
Hmm.
And I found that quote to be very interesting because like when you think about the political landscape right now,
Hmm.
you just like think of the first word that comes to mind for me is polarizing.
Yeah, yeah. And I think it definitely is, but I think it's hard for people to take a look at, what is polarized? Okay, when we're talking about polarization, we're looking at Congress, right? That's what we think of. And we think of the national parties and we think of, the last presidential election and how tense that was and how tense things are right now in this country between people of different parties. But if you take a look at it, on a more micro level, you realize that among young people, these differences are not as pronounced um, because I don't think that they ascribe to the typical ideology of both of these parties, and I think that's especially true among the young Republicans who I interviewed. Um, I think in the past few days we've seen a lot of divides among the Republican Party, and I think that's a major part of our politics going forward in the next couple of years. Is where is that party going? And there's some great organizations, like I'll shout out Gen Z GOP, who's doing a lot of work now about what the future of the Republican Party looks like. And in the research I've done, you look at Generation Z and you see that they agree on issues like climate change, on gun control, on racial justice. And I think that these are facts that can't be ignored. I think that in the future, as Generation Z gains more political clout, we start to see a little bit of a moderation in both parties and possibly politicians looking more toward the center and being less extreme. So that's definitely something in my book that has made me hopeful
That
that
makes me so much happier.
yeah, the state of our politics doesn't always have to be so polarized.
Yeah.
We agree with each other on a lot of things. It's that our national politicians don't agree with each other on a lot of things. So yeah, I think that's really important for people to understand.
Well, and I definitely think Noah, we've had this conversation that both parties are drifting way too far to their respective
Mhm.
corners, and the middle ground has just completely it's nearly collapsing. It
Yeah.
might already be collapsed for right now. But
Mhm.
what did the young Republicans who you spoke to, what did they have to what were their main concerns about the Republican Party in the future?
Yeah. So I'll actually talk a little bit about my former classmate Alex, who went to Scotch Plains Fanwood, and he is a conservative, but he's kind of gotten away from affiliating with the party specifically in the past few years. And we were having a conversation about this, and it's something that I've taken a look at in my research in college for my political science courses as well. Is shifting demographics in this country. So you take a look at Georgia. The reason why that state flipped blue is predominantly because of the Atlanta suburbs and the growing Black population there, which is trending younger and more diverse. And you also take a look at Texas, which is trending more blue, and that's because of a growing young Latino population there. And Arizona as well. We don't talk a lot about indigenous voters, but they had a huge influence in Arizona as well, the Navajo and the Hopi people there. So Generation Z is also the most diverse generation in American history. Just a little over half of Gen Z identifies as non-Hispanic white. So there is a huge population of racial and ethnic minorities in Generation Z. And if you take a look at the base of the Republican Party right now, it does not reflect um, the changing demographics in America at this moment. So I think that's a major concern for them, is whether they're addressing these issues that matter to Black and Brown and Indigenous voters across the country, and specifically to the young people in those demographics. So I think that they have a lot of soul searching to do as far as their policies and what that looks like on both a state and national scale with these shifting demographics. I think that's a major threat to their electoral viability in the future. Just, sometimes politics is a numbers game. And you look at popular vote versus the electoral college, and you could see that Republicans have lost the the popular vote in 7 out of the last 8 elections. So I think that looking at it from that numbers angle with the shifting demographics and the GOP's policies now, it's really difficult for them to be winning national contests as more Generation Zers come of voting age.
Do you think that think tanks like down in DC, like the Heritage Foundation, are seeing the same things that you're seeing, or do you think they are still refusing to change and kind of stuck in their old ways?
I think that's difficult to say, but I would say that they're probably aware of this. It's something that's brought up often in my political science courses. Political scientists are aware of it. They have been aware of it. And I think, speaking from my own perspective, I think some politicians are running scared of it as well. And that some of these demographic changes have been used to tap into white fear as well. And I think that some politicians have chosen to play into that rather than to play the long game of their potential electoral viability in the future. So I will say it's not something that they can be running away from anymore, really. I think it's time for them to start working with that knowledge instead of trying to work against it. But yeah, I can't really say much as to whether they're incorporating that in their strategy or not. But, I think it's definitely something to be looking at over the next few years.
This sort of ties into the last question, but I think as people get older, people tend to get more conservative. Do you think the changing demographic is going to influence it, and also how politicians are playing more into the white fear and the now rather than the later? Is that going to change the usual, like, as you get older, you get more conservative?
I think it's really difficult to forecast that into the future. But from the research that I've been looking at, I kind of take Gen Z and I look at millennials right now. And actually, I don't have the statistics right now at my disposal of the data set, but millennials have actually become more progressive over time. Even though, the oldest millennials right now are, I think, like in their early 40s, maybe. Don't quote me on that. But I think it will be interesting to watch that generation over the next few years or decade or so to see whether they get more conservative, because I feel like, well, obviously Generation Z does have a lot of the same characteristics as the millennial generation. We have a lot of the same shared experiences. But I think it's natural to get more conservative over time. That's a phenomenon that we've seen for decades in American politics, just simply because of entering the workforce, earning your own money, having to pay taxes, getting worried about the budget. Those are typically conservative things. Obviously, tax cuts, I would say that's the bedrock of the Republican Party. I've always been taught is really lower taxes and the government shouldn't be taking your money, smaller government. But I will also say that Generation Z and millennials as well believe that the government should play, a majority of them believe that the government should play a more active role in solving society's problems, which would therefore look towards a bigger government model, which is not what conservatism is about. So we'll see how those views change over time. But at this moment, I don't really believe that we resemble the baby boomers in that way. Yeah. But obviously the political landscape change over time, and what it means to be conservative changes over time too. So that we'll see about that.
Well, 15 years from now, you're going to be in charge with informing the public again about Generation Z, just about how these views have changed over time. Mm-hmm. So yeah. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of Generation Z. So like, for example, a lot of high school students, they love to post on Instagram and they love to get, they pretty much get all their social media, all their news from social media. They just love the tabloids, love the sexy headlines. Are you worried about, like, is that part of Generation Z? Are you worried about like the lack of like patience with like reading and like wanting to learn, just kind of like scrolling through headlines to figure it out? Does that worry you?
I think it definitely does worry me. Everyone who I talk to, I ask them, I'm like, where do you get your news from? Yeah. And what does everyone say? Social media, right? Okay. Twitter is the newspaper now.
Twitter is
it's really difficult, and the media market is so saturated right now with different sources. That's part of the reason for the polarization is, our grandparents used to watch Walter Cronkite. Everyone watched him. Okay, you had CBS, NBC, ABC. That was it. And everyone was watching the same news sources. Now I can open my phone and I can scour the web for whatever opinions I want.
Everybody loves OAN, just
it's very difficult. But I think right now we're seeing, I think this election kind of opened some people's eyes to that, as well as the findings of the Mueller report, and kind of how influential some political advertisements can be. I think that one of the major tasks of government in the next decade is the regulation of political advertising on the internet, and securing American elections in that way. A lot of people think that means something along the lines of censorship. It doesn't. It's just that now there are hardly any regulations relating to digital political advertising. And we see debates over things like, should Twitter have taken down Donald Trump's Twitter account? That is a valid debate to be having about the power of social media companies, to kind of, they get to decide who gets to speak and who doesn't, but they're private companies. So I think over the next decade, that debate is going to rage on even more, and we're going to see a big crackdown on misinformation. What exactly does that mean? I'm not sure. I wrote a 27-page research paper about it, but I still couldn't tell you exactly what that's going to look like.
So is it very much so arbitrary?
I don't know. I wouldn't say it's arbitrary. There are definitely proposals out there about how to regulate it, and I had conversations with some law professors for my paper, and the former chairwoman of the FEC, and they were just kind of talking about the moderation of these sites and what that looks like for them to be consistent moderators. And right now they have pretty much discretion over everything that happens on their sites, and I think that misinformation is a huge problem that needs to be dealt with by the government and not just by these social media companies as the moderators of their own platforms.
Yeah, and that could kind of doom Generation Z by consuming this misinformation. That's one of the reasons why we had the issue at the Capitol last week.
Yeah.
Because of this misinformation swirling. And so kind of transitioning into that, when you saw that happen last Wednesday, like what were your initial reactions, and are you going to include a little bit about that before you submit your final manuscript?
Yes, for sure. I was working on revisions this morning, and I was adding some stuff in about that because it has enormous implications for our country and the future of our politics. And I think it was a breaking point for people in this country, especially people who have previously supported Donald Trump. I've been having conversations with some of them after this event, kind of to gauge their reactions, and people are very displeased. His approval rating is at an all-time low, and I think that a historic second impeachment, a potential trial in the Senate after Joe Biden is inaugurated. We don't know what else we're going to learn about this event. Obviously, I was glued to the news the whole time watching it because as any American, I was concerned first and foremost about the safety of our elected officials and our democratic institutions. But also in the week or so after, the more we learn about it, the more disturbing this event is. And the larger its implications become for our elected officials and the stances that they take on it. I think that's important for people to realize that this event is going to be looked back on for years and possibly decades. It was historic. And people's reactions to it, our politicians' reactions to it, are going to matter as well. So it's definitely something I'm looking at just in the larger context of what the aftermath means for both parties and for our national politics as well.
And you were just talking about the response from politicians. Mm-hmm. What did you think of the speeches made by the Congress people on Wednesday night? Like, is that enough?
I think that the impeachment was a huge step in the right direction after that, to show on the record that this was a historic event and that it will not be tolerated. And I think it matters for, the oral history of our nation as well, to see that this resulted in the second impeachment of a president. So I believe that that was beneficial and that was a good consequence, obviously, for what took place. But words aren't enough. Words matter. Rhetoric is important, especially from our leaders. But it's not enough to say that you're disappointed and concerned. You have to act in accordance with what you're saying. So in the coming weeks, I think it will be really important to see ramifications for these individuals. Obviously all the arrests that we're seeing are good, but also for our elected officials who unfortunately were involved in inciting this and emboldening these people. So I think that is really important for the continuity of our democracy, that this conduct is not allowed and will not be accepted from elected officials. So obviously, Senators Ted Cruz and Josh Hawley, I think that they're going to face some consequences from this.
I bet Josh Hawley's really missing his book deal too right now.
Yeah. I understand it's a lot of hard work to write a book. It doesn't feel too good for someone to say that we can't publish it, but it's kind of what happens when you embolden people who are trying to execute public officials, including yourself. So yeah, I think it's definitely interesting to look at the aftermath of this.
And for the record, Twitter was incredible about making fun of his lost book deal.
Yes.
I read too many good tweets about that. And my next question for you is, and I talked to Noah about this earlier. Mm-hmm. I'm a little bit worried that even if Trump doesn't run in 2024, that the GOP finds a way to repackage this idea of Trumpism into mm-hmm. their 2024 candidate. Maybe tone down the rhetoric, maybe don't label it as Trumpism. But is that still going to be present in the GOP?
I think this is definitely something that I have been debating myself on as well, because this book does clearly predict that Trumpism is not here to stay forever. But I don't, like you said, I don't know whether that is Donald Trump is not here to stay forever, or if his ideology is not here to stay forever. So as I was saying about the ramifications for some of the senators and congressmen who were involved in this, that also means a condemnation of Trump's ideology, his rhetoric, his actions. And I think that needs to be a consequence, not just for him, but for the people who try to replicate him in the future. In the future, some more polished demagogue might come along and be able to, I hope not as well, but it's possible. It's something we always have to think about, right? We're a young democracy still, a young country, and these things unfortunately happen. But that's why consequences for these people are so important. And more consequences for Trump are more important as well. Because you got to lead by example, and you got to establish precedent for this and say this is not tolerated in the United States of America. So I don't know whether Trumpism is dead forever, but I will say that it is not the future of the Republican Party under millennials and Generation Z. That is what I think.
Will he go down as one of the most consequential presidents of all time?
I wouldn't say exactly consequential, but I would say he might go down as, I don't know what the adjective is. He's been impeached twice, right? Okay, that's historic. That takes a lot of effort on his part.
He's gonna take that to the grave. Yeah, exactly. He's gonna put that on his tombstone.
Yeah, it's a permanent mark on his record. And there was the Pew poll that came out today about his approval and everything, and people saying, he will be looked back on as one of the worst presidents. So I think that that's more likely, but I think it will be interesting to see how him and his rhetoric and his ideology and the condemnation of his actions at the beginning of kind of this post-Trump era, what that means for the future of the Republican Party as well. If he is convicted by the Senate, that means something. That means he's no longer our guy. We're not associating ourselves with him. Yeah. We will be going on this path and he will be going that way. And we're not building our party around him anymore. But, I don't know what it means for him to not be, to be acquitted by the Senate, and for senators and representatives to continue to support him in the years to come. It's very difficult. But I can't imagine a scenario where long-term his appeal continues, like he continues to have some kind of like Ronald Reagan-esque control over the Republican Party and its values.
Noah, what do you think?
Well, no, I think without Trump, there's no Trumpism. He's the figure of it all. Like, people love him. I'd say more than the ideas he brings. So I think without him, there's not Trumpism.
It's kind of this cult of personality he's built around himself, right? And that's usually the language we use in political science for dictators, honestly, is building a movement around themselves as a character, as some kind of, ideal of a person rather than just their ideologies and rhetoric. Like, he came in as some kind of celebrity, as some kind of outsider. He tried to make himself look like a martyr for these people as well. Like, they're taking me, they'll take you too, but yeah, I think that's why it matters, kind of the narratives that we build around his presidency and ultimately his demise.
Well, I look forward to hopefully Adam McKay doing a movie sometime down the road. I'm sure Hollywood will totally make a ton of money off of whatever Trump documentary, Trump movie. Because, okay, all the people that hate him are still going to go see that movie.
Exactly. I would watch that movie, to be honest. I would watch
that movie too. Because I bet it would be really good.
Yeah.
Even though you'd have to relive, for some people, the worst 4 years of their like political life, or yeah. So do you think that we'll experience, Generation Z, we will experience some sort of political normalcy as like adults? Because I was speaking with some of my friends earlier this week, and they weren't really interested in politics at the second term of Obama's year. Like, they really got introduced to politics in 2016 by Trump versus Clinton, like this heavyweight battle. And then in 2008, you had the housing market crisis. So will we see that political normalcy?
So I'm going to kind of go into a little bit of the theory behind my book and generational theory here, and saying that, I build on a lot of the work that was laid by Neil Howe and William Strauss, who are two renowned generational theorists. And they kind of took a look at different generations throughout American history, cycles of American history and patterns. And there's kind of 4 different seasons that each last about like 20 years, say, and they comprise a cycle.
Oh, and right now, is this the 5 parts because I was about to ask a question about the 5 parts of your book. So is this kind of that introduction to that?
Kind of. So it's this is the foundation of my book, is that right now, according to these theorists, we are in what is called a crisis period. And that lasts about 20-ish years. And that started in 2008 with the housing crisis.
Interesting.
So therefore it would end somewhere around 2030. So we could be heading into the end of this period sometime in the next few years, and then we would then be entering a new season, which would be a high. Similar, the last time that happened was like the happy days of the 1950s. So if that's what we have to look forward to, I would say that's good news. I don't know if it's quite that happy, but I think there are things to look forward to, and I think that at some point we will gain some sense of normalcy back if we take a look at history and history cycles. I think it's good news, not right now, but somewhere in the near future, it's good news for us.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So the 50s, if we're going to be back in the happy days, we got to put up all that wallpaper.
Yeah, I guess so.
I just have a quick story to tell. So my uncle, he bought a house this past year. And inside the house, like it's an old ranch. And so they had to like rip down like all of like the ugly 50s wallpaper. And I remember going into the house and kind of like seeing what was going on. And he was just like showing me like the before and after like videos of like, okay, here's this nice painted wall, and then before this like ugly flowery wallpaper and like a pink bathroom.
Yeah.
It's horrendous.
Sounds like my grandma's house.
So in between the 2008 crisis and then the 50s, what is all of that considered?
Just, you mean just in terms of like how it mirrors it?
Yeah, I guess.
Yeah, so the crisis period we're in right now, the last time a crisis period happened was during World War II. Yeah. So, and then we enter the happy days of the 1950s after that. So while it won't be the same as the 1950s, a high usually does entail, some kind of political catharsis, economic boom, and general satisfaction, an efficient government, a rebuilding of civic life as well, because usually out of crisis periods, something along the lines of like a new order is formed. So I think that we can look forward to some kind of democratic reform in the next few years, and kind of filling in some of the gaps that we know now exist in our government that were kind of revealed in the Trump era, and maybe a little bit in the post-Trump era and also the post-COVID era, as well. So I think that there are a lot of things to look forward to, and I think that also Generation Z is at the forefront of that, and that in this crisis period we would be acting kind of as heroes per se, and working together to lead America out of this crisis period and enjoying the benefits of the high that's to come in the late 2020s / early 2030s. So good news for us.
This podcast has made me feel much better about the future.
Yeah, that's the hope with this book. I don't want it to be so depressing about, the state of our politics right now. I want people also to look forward to a future where we have a better, more efficient government as well.
So well said. And so before you go, I just have a couple more questions.
Mm-hmm.
So there's 5 parts to Voter Z. I interrupted you before about this 5-part
Yeah, it's fine.
question. But do you want to give us like a brief outline about those 5 parts?
Yeah, sure. So part 1 is kind of the introduction. So a lot of that generational theory, like I was talking about before, outlined in that portion, and kind of taking a look at who is Generation Z? What are they doing right now? why is there such an intense focus on them and such a struggle to understand what they're about. So that's about 2 chapters or so, with just the intro and a chapter I call Z-Bellion, which is all about a hypothetical war scenario that the Pentagon made up of Generation Zers promoting an uprising against the government, and taking a look in the context of that, why people think we're so revolutionary, which I just think it's an interesting case study and something to build off of. And then, part 2, kind of taking a look at what makes Generation Z. What are the formative events in our lifetime that have shaped our collective generational outlook? So taking a look at, the Iraq War, the 2008 financial recession, and then so that was kind of our early childhood. The 2008 election also, which served as our introduction to politics. And then part 3, kind of taking a look at some more events and some people who have inspired us, and some of the things that Generation Z activists are doing now. So kind of looking at my chapter index here to guide me. I have my whole manuscript on my computer, which is kind of scary. And taking a look at, I talked about, how we're the most diverse generation in American history. So taking a look at how that impacts us. We're also the most proud generation, I like to call us, with a lot of LGBTQ plus people represented in Generation Z. And then taking a look at also young Republicans, women, Latino voters. Also, there's a profile of Pete Buttigieg in there as well. And then part 4, kind of taking a look at some of the politicians who inspire us and how we vote. So there's a chapter dedicated to our voting habits, a chapter dedicated to why young people love Bernie Sanders so much. Everyone I talk to, his name comes up. Why people love AOC so much and how she represents a new kind of millennial politician.
And what do you think about AOC?
Yeah, so, I have mixed opinions on her personally, but I do believe that she is revolutionary in the way that she's able to connect with not just her constituents, but young Americans all across the country, and how she's kind of able to bridge that divide between politics and reality as well, where she doesn't feel like so much of a distant political figure. She feels a lot more relatable, and she's able to effectively message. I think she's a great messenger, and I think that she could teach both parties a lot about outreach to young people, and specifically young people of color as well, and how to speak their language. Yeah. So I think that's hugely important.
I'm not a huge fan of her policy, but I always think about as far as being a leader and being relatable, I always think about her being on Twitch and playing Among Us.
Yeah.
That's the
she meets young people where they are. I think that's really important. You can't just expect, young people are not as politically active, and it's because people don't include them in the process. They don't bring them in. So meet them where they are. I think that's really important.
Yeah, so that's very smart by AOC.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Part 4 kind of rounds out with some discussion of youth activists, organizers, the Parkland students, and then part 5 takes a look at where are we going. So taking a look at the ongoing pandemic and how that's affecting young Americans, and then also kind of what we can look forward to in the post-Trump era and what it means for our politics to be moving into the 2020s.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate you spending time with us. I just have one final question. Mm-hmm. I kind of keep during an episode, it's constant I have this question, and it kind of makes the list of questions that I already have even longer. Mm-hmm. So you mentioned that when you started scrolling through your chapter index, and you said it's kind of scary that you have your whole manuscript at your fingertips. Mm-hmm. I guess my question is for you, what was it like to finish that book, to be able to publish something tangible that you could put into people's hands and they could mm-hmm. digest?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I'm in the final stages now of, putting my book together and doing final edits. And I have a meeting about my cover next week. So it's really exciting to see it turn into something that I can hold into my hand, that I can put on my bookshelf back there with my other books as well. I think it means a lot to produce something, and to have something to show people, as well, that I'm capable of writing a book too.
Yeah.
But it's also amazing to be able to share this narrative with other people, not just in my generation, but in other generations as well, and to hopefully have it as, kind of a way for people to look in the future, maybe to look back on Generation Z as well. I hope it serves as a resource to people to understand us more, and also to understand this period of time in history, because I believe it's a really important period historically. So I'm kind of able to create that narrative, and it's just amazing to have that.
Noah, you have anything to add?
No, I'm good.
Well, thank you again, Jen. And should we tell listeners, should we follow your Instagram, Twitter, or if they want to learn more about you?
Yeah, sure. So Instagram at Jen Lambert _. My Twitter, where I post about politics and things, is at on the lamb _. And yeah, the
That's
book
a great
will be.
Twitter handle, by the way.
Thank you. Yeah. And my book will be available in April of this year on Amazon and Barnes and Noble. So yeah.
Well, congratulations again, and
Thank
thank
you.
you. And
No
to our
problem.
listeners, I hope you guys enjoyed that episode, and have a great weekend. All right, see you guys soon.